Hi, I'm Whitney Espick, the CEO of the MIT Alumni Association, and I hope you enjoy this digital production created for alumni and friends like you.
I'm Nora Murphy, as you know, I work in the Institute Archives and Special Collections, a department of the MIT Libraries. I'm honored to be here with you and to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Black Student Union. I also have the honor of co-teaching the MIT in Slavery class with Professor Craig Stephen Wilder, which is why I'm here. He's not able to be here today, but he is, when we do the class, the true expert on the topic, and I help the students identify and use original and secondary materials when they do their research. But it's more than just a class. It's a small community, I think, that is formed. And these are 3 of the 4 students who were in the first class a year ago who continued to come back. Charlotte and Mahi were in the class last spring, but Kelvin and Alicia continued to come to class in the spring to stop in, see how things were going, and see how they could help with the class. But I'll give you a little bit more on that. First, let me just let you know what we're going to do. I'm going to share a little bit of information about how the class came to be. Then I'll introduce my colleagues. They'll each present, and then I'll share a little bit of the findings of the 4th student, Alicia Alexander, and my research on William Barton Rogers' slaveholding, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So as you may know, in the spring of 2017, President Rife was at Harvard at a symposium on slavery at Harvard and left and said, well, MIT was founded in 1861. We didn't have the first classes till 1865. I have a button I sometimes push when I'm explaining MIT, and that's where we start the narrative. At that charter, we don't look to see where MIT actually was and its place in history. But he thought, suppose I'm wrong. So he talked to Dean Melissa Nobles, and she said, let's talk to Craig Wilder because he really knows. He's done a lot of research. He had come out with Ebony and Ivy, a history of the relationship to slavery in a lot of the institutions, academic institutions in the US, the early ones in the South. So in spite of every single college and university who has been looking into their connections to slavery, to the slave economies, everybody did it differently. Brown was the first, and convened a panel to really look into a commission to look in various aspects of Brown's history. Other academic institutions did different things. They sometimes hired a researcher to do the research. There were undergraduates in some places. There were graduate students who were involved. There might be a faculty member driving things. But Craig said, this is MIT. Let's have the undergraduate students really do the research and look into our history. As Dean Nobles has said very eloquently, MIT was not born of nothing. It was a creation of the US and the world as it was in the middle of the 19th century, which was coming out of very, very close ties to slave economies, but slavery was still in existence in 1861 when MIT was founded. Rogers himself had a long history of teaching in the South, had very many connections with the scientific and technical geniuses and inventors around the world. We think of today as having instant communication. Theirs was not instant, but it was frequent. So he knew what the developments were. He was very aware of the economies and the technologies that were available. One of the things that Craig is doing this semester is, and has been working on, is trying to work with other technical academic institutions to see what we share with them in our histories, all of them developed in the 19th century. So let me introduce our students for today. First, we have Charlotte Minsky, who is a 3rd-year undergraduate studying course 12 and course 21E. She participated in both semesters of the first year of the MIT in Slavery course, and her research focused on MIT students from the South and the relationship to the railroad industry. On campus, she is president and co-founder of the Prison Education Initiative, president of Queer West, and a member of the ADER Interfaith Dialogue Program. Charlotte will be followed by Mahi Elango, who is a junior double majoring in computer science and brain and cognitive sciences. She took both semesters of the MIT and slavery class as well. In the first semester, she explored the early MIT curriculum and the discussion of post-slavery issues such as productivity, engineering advances, and the pedagogy right after the end of the Civil War at MIT. In the second semester, she helped prepare the findings of the fall research for publication on the website, doing additional research on the economic and political landscape of Boston at the time and legacies of the class findings. Kelvin Green, the second, is our third participant in the panel this morning, and he is a second-year student. I'm not going to add any more introduction. I think you all know Kelvin, and he's going to talk about what his research findings are. Once they get done, I'll share what Mahi learned. So I don't know if everybody's going to stand up or sit down. Stand up. So I'll leave the microphone here, and Charlotte.
Hello. So as Nora said, my name is Charlotte Minsky, and my research focused on the early Southern students at MIT, trying to reevaluate the origin story of MIT were told in the context of the Civil War. So I started my research by going through course catalogs for the first 15 years of MIT from 1865 to 1881 in an attempt to see sort of what the situation was of Southern students from the South coming to MIT. And one of the things I found was that for the most part, geographically, these students were evenly distributed. There was no more than one or two students from any particular city, except for the unique case of Louisville. And 29 of these Southern students, of the 29 of these Southern students, 11 were from Louisville. So I was curious about this disproportionate representation. And I found that there was not just disproportionate representation from Louisville, but overall from the border states, which occupied a very unique role in US history at this time. So I wanted to figure out why Louisville and the border states were particularly poised to send students to get a technical education. And there are a few possible factors that I looked into. So Louisville, in contrast to many other Southern cities at the time, actually had, but prior to the Civil War, had a percentage of enslaved residents which was decreasing rather than increasing. And so at first glance, it could look like Louisville was less entwined in the slave trade as other Southern cities. But that percentage refers to the number of standing enslaved residents. And what's hidden in those numbers is the fact that there was a huge number of people being transported through Louisville down the Ohio River. And so Louisville was able to benefit economically from the slave trade while not undergoing the demographic and labor shifts after the Civil War that other Southern cities did. It also was a center of development for the railroad industry because its economic position was so tied to its ability to ship people down the Ohio River to be sold, that when waterways became less important in the US transportation infrastructure, Louisville invested heavily in the railroad industry, which will become important later. Louisville, as well as the other border states, also benefited from Union occupation during the war. Instead of being destroyed by the war, military money was flowing into the city and those states during the time. And finally, Louisville and the border states had social and institutional ties to the north that were not as heavily severed during the war as cities deeper south. So to investigate further this relationship with the South, I looked in particular at 3 students, and they were Nelson Whitney Conant, Ernest Saltmarsh, and Joshua Breed. And these were the first 3 students from the South to attend MIT for 4 years or more. And I researched their careers after graduation and sketched sort of a basic trajectory of their jobs. And what jumped out to me, I don't know if it jumps out to you immediately, is railroads. Yeah. So it was actually not just these 3. And it turns out that not only Southern students, but all alums between 1865 and 1887. For that group of graduates, the railroad industry was the #1 specific industry that students went into. So it was second only to things like business, which encompass a lot of different industries. And this makes sense because not only was Louisville in particular a node of connection between the northern and southern railroad networks, as you can see in this 1861 map, but broadly, railroads were the engine of Reconstruction at this time, and there was a lot of federal, state, and institutional money flowing into them. And so MIT students were participating in this post-Civil War infrastructure building. So it may not be immediately clear what this research tells you, but there is often a perception that the North and South were and are culturally, economically, and socially disparate places. But this shows that not only is that false, but that MIT was a critical juncture for the exchange of people, resources, education, and ideas between the North and South. That there was a flow from Louisville and the border states, which were benefiting from the slave trade while escaping a lot of the legacies of it, to MIT. And then there was a flow from MIT into the railroad industry of the South, which has its own racial complications. And really, the story of MIT is not necessarily one of firsts and of progress, but largely it's the story of Reconstruction. And so what this impels us to question is what industries now dominate our students' postgraduate trajectories, and in what power structures are those industries entrenched? When we interface so heavily with the state apparatus that purports to protect us and our rights and values, just as the Union forces protected Louisville, who is included in that us and in those values? And finally, what national forces of inequality are we still consenting to building our prestige off of, just as MIT built its prestige off of Reconstruction in the railroad industry and relationships to the South? And with that, I am proud to present Mahi Elango as our next presenter.
Hello, my name is Mahi, and thank you so much for having us here today. My research last year was on exploring the early MIT curriculum and the circulation of ideas right after the end of the Civil War in 1865. I asked in particular, what are students and faculty members learning and teaching and discussing in the context of an entirely new host of post-slavery issues, such as labor, productivity, engineering advances, and the pedagogy of these subjects. Not only is this about the circulation of these ideas, but also about MIT graduates entering the labor force and contributing to engineering advances themselves that deal with the aftermath of the Civil War. So I began with our motto, Mens et Manus, or mind in hand, and I sort of asked, how well does MIT's curriculum actually reflect our motto, especially in the early days of MIT? And to really understand the intersection of the mind and hand, I focused on the mining and metallurgy department established in 1865. This department was particularly interesting for a few reasons. The first is that it embodied core principles of the Institute to develop both the hand and the mind, as we'll see later reflecting in the class's initiatives taken. The second was, it was the pride of MIT. The department once included geology, which was William Barton Rogers' specialty, and later presidents such as President Runkle also specialized in these fields and took a particular interest in this department. And third, outside of non-agricultural occupations, so few industries made use of slaves so universally and over such an extended period of time, particularly the production of iron and coal in Virginia and Maryland. So this is the required course catalog for a typical third and fourth year student, mining student in 1873. And there are some interesting features that I've highlighted. The first is field practice. So these students would go on summer excursions with their professors and fellow students to mines that once employed slaves, but suddenly no longer used those slaves, and brought up very interesting questions about power dynamics and how will the structure look like once they're no longer slaves, but now that these students are learning engineering advances and using practically in the field. The second is laboratory practice. President Runkle, who was president after William Barton Rogers, as I'll later discuss, had this idea of instruction versus construction shops. So systematic and thorough instruction to impart artisan skill. So again, developing the hand as much as the mind. And ensure that they would not just learn the techniques to the convenience and profit of their employers, but again, for their own artisan skill. And the third you'll notice in the right-hand corner is political economy and logic classes, which were introduced in 1872 when MIT hired George Holmes Howison as the first professor of philosophy and logic. And I'll go into this later as well. So as I mentioned earlier, the mining and metallurgy department was the pride of MIT. And this is the International Centennial Fair of 1876, which MIT attended. And this is a short, brief introduction of the report back that President Runkle had given in MIT's yearly report. And he highlights these excursions to mining regions and manufacturing works. And again, this huge importance on the mining and metallurgy labs. And so here's a map of the mining excursions that students took each summer. Part of the research that I wanted to do after the class ended was to really look at these particular mines. Where are they going? Who is working there? What does it look like after? But you can see that they've really traveled across the US and have been interfacing with all sorts of different people. But again, the core ideology is that these mines once employed slaves and only slaves. And now that they no longer have them, like what's happening? And how is MIT contributing to these post-slavery issues, particularly at mines? And so circling back to the course catalog, I sort of want to focus on the political economy class. So this is an example examination of the fourth year's class in political and economy in 1873. Pretty interesting. Number 4, define labor and prove that the service of slaves or any other involuntary work is not labor in the economic sense. So these students, not only are they talking about literal engineering advances in their field, but they're also explicitly talking about what it means to be a slave, what it means to work in economies that once used slaves and no longer use slaves. And again, these questions about labor, productivity, how does MIT play a role in both how it's educating its students, but also in the students that are actually now going to work in these mines, replacing once was fully slave-based. So I found this really exciting to see because like we no longer take political economy classes. We're not required to take any classes that ask us to question the ethics and morals of what we're doing in engineering classes. But clearly from the very beginning of MIT, like both the mind and the hand have been very critical parts to how we educate ourselves, about how we think of ourselves in an engineering sense as well. Thank you so much. And introduce a great friend, Kelvin.
Hello. So my research, the question I wanted to ask is how are students kind of dealing with issues of race and slavery at MIT? And the way that I thought that would be the best to look at that is through the images that they produce themselves in their publications. We know the images, people say a picture holds 1,000 words. And I think you'll see as I take you through kind of the images that I found as I just scrolled through the online tech archives as well as through the technique books that are in the archives, just finding images and pulling them and seeing trends, that you'll see that these images really carry a lot of meaning. And so the tech, I was able to look at about 30 volumes of the tech and 14 volumes of technique, and so you'll see that some years says the images span a certain set of years, but the images are only maybe within a less time frame than that. That's simply because over a few years I wasn't able to find any images that related to that content. But the first image that we see of a Black person in an MIT student publication happens in 1883. And this caption, Hotel Modern No Fee No Dinner, kind of shows even from this aspect, this tension as it relates to after the Reconstruction era of the racial tensions. And so you see there's food, there's an expected pay for the service that this waiter is providing, but there's obviously shown in the image this white man who's not even looking at the waiter, who's not even paying him, and it's kind of showing why would this image appear in the tech? What is this speaking to the relationships between the students, the white students at MIT at this time, and the staff that was working there? Another image that actually was the face of the 17th volume and 13th issue of the tech, which a couple black students were at MIT at this time that would have seen this as the face of their student newspaper, has this caption, and I'll read it just to give voice to what black students may have saw at that time. I'll read the transliteration. I don't see why white people make so much fun of us colored people. One of the greatest men in the Bible was named Nicodemus. And this caption, you have to ask yourself, what were black students feeling at this time? And I'll come more to like I'll speak more later about the silences that existed in the black student population. But this is an image that they saw. This is an image that their students produced, and not only produced, but placed at the face of their publication. And so over the years, looking over the 30 volumes, these were the images that I found of waiters. And there were images as it relates to the senior dinners that were happening. And these were the main images of black students, if not the only black students of black images that I was able to find. And so this begs the question, is this the truth about the demographics of black people at this time? Were they mainly waiters? Was this an accurate representation? And Professor Adelaide M. Cromwell, who's Dean Emerita of Boston University, actually did research during this period of time looking at what were the occupations of black people at this time in Boston. And what she found is that they were not mainly waiters, but they were also tailors, they were students, they were engineers. And we know that at MIT, there were also black students at this time. And so this begs the question, why, if the demographics of the occupations of black people at this time were diverse, was this the main image that was portrayed? And how does that affect a student's psychology as well as the psychology of, not just a black student's psychology and not seeing themselves represented, but also how does this affect what the white students were thinking about black people at this time? The next set of images that I found were of Klansman attire. And these are all featured in the Technique, which is our yearbook. If you look, oh wait, sorry. I think, is this the laser? Sorry, is this the laser? Sorry. This one?
That's pointing.
Okay. Yeah. So if we look in the cave here, we can see, so first we just see just the hood, and when I saw the hood, I was like, is this what I think it is? Because for some reason, and I don't know why, but for some reason, and I think it has to do kind of what Charlotte was talking about, you think that the North and the South are kind of disparate, and you're like, there wouldn't be a blatant representation of Klansmen in MIT yearbook, would there? And so I kept flipping through, and then I found not just the hood, but also the cloak being worn in here. And then also down here, you see Klansmen at the foot of this person who may be speaking to them. And students knew the terror and the symbolism of Klansman attire at this time. And so this also begs the question, if this is what white students were thinking, not only how was this affecting black students, but why was this imagery even allowed to be mass produced at this time? And also, why would the fraternities, as you see, this is the cover page for the fraternities, why would the fraternities cover page image include Klansmen? And what does that speak about maybe the terror that was happening between the fraternity community at MIT and the black students community, or any non-white male community? The third set of images that I found were in relation to entertainment. So this first one was just, I saw a black person playing the banjo and singing, then seeing that again here. And then there was a sketch class where I'm led to believe, and I think there's still more research, I'm hoping to actually find this research, but that maybe black students were actually being drawn, so like asked maybe to like sit there as we draw you, because this is an image drawn of a black girl. And then this last image, which I'll highlight, of a minstrel show. And so for context, minstrel shows are racially charged forms of entertainment. They mocked the perceived stereotypes of Black people at this time, with white students and white people wearing blackface. And this is something that not just existed at MIT, but existed across the nation. And the stereotypes that they were saying about Black people were that they were dim-witted, they were lazy, they were buffoonish. And we were actually able to, in the spring when I was speaking with Nora and visited the class, we were actually able to find a picture of MIT students in their blackface at this actual, because at this point in time, I saw this and I was like, okay, it's in the yearbook. I'm assuming that there was an event, but we actually were able to find the actual picture of the event at that time. And so now this minstrel show also brings in all the ties, all the themes that I mentioned earlier. You had people wearing blackface acting in the service, in the servitude. As waiters, you had Klansman attire being worn and being portrayed, those terrors. You had entertainment, obviously, with music, and assuming that Black people are naturally gifted in music and can sing and play instruments. And so minstrel shows, as one of the last images that I found, kind of combines all of those themes that were present, heavily present in MIT student publications in those early years. But I will, as I transition into Lily White, an article that happened in 1989, I will mention again that during that period of time of all of those images, where we know that Black students were attending MIT, we don't actually hear what they thought about these images. And we can't really, hopefully through more research, we may be able to find the things that they were thinking, but so far, I can't find anything about, what did you feel when you saw this image, or what did you think, what was going on? And so the way that it seems Black student voices were silenced in those periods of times, I was able to find an article where we're actually able to hear a Black student voice. So Lily White, this is the cartoon that was featured in the tech. And this is in reference to, so there's a event on Virginia Beach where a lot of people part of Divine Nine organizations would meet up on Labor Day weekend and party and have fun. But in 1989, there was a lot of unrest that was happening simply because a lot of the white student population were kind of at odds and at agitation with a lot of the Black community that just came from all the way around and kind of made that city, I guess, Blacker than it usually is. And a lot of people were uncomfortable with that. And with a lot of the events that were happening subsequently, there was police that were involved, horses, helicopters, injuries, a lot of rioting that was happening on. And so all of this was happening, and MIT was engaging in that conversation with this ad that says, Lily White, the official suntan lotion of Virginia Beach, with this guy wearing a Klansman hat. And so in response to this, Dave Atkins' class of 1990, who was a white man, grad student in East Campus, wrote an article saying that this cartoon misrepresented what actually happened in Virginia Beach. In some of the words that I bolded, he said, if anybody did the right thing, because he was talking about how Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing was inciting violence in the Black community and making them angry and more prone to act in violence. But if anybody did the right thing, it was the police, who, faced with many opportunities to allow anger to encourage them to misuse their authority and power, chose restraint. And then he said, what would those who feel they are not racist have us do? Surrender the streets to an angry mob? So he was basically encouraging that, the police had to act in this way. Why would they not? These Black people came to this city, and I should mention that he is from Virginia Beach, and he felt that, this is my hometown. How are you gonna say that we're a racist city? In response to that, in a later issue, Danelia Gladden, class of 1991, who was a Black woman grad student living at East Campus, wrote an article saying that I was there and I saw what happened, and how you're engaging with this and talking about it is inaccurate. She said, I would like to refute most of those comments that he made. The hotel owners were increasing the rates and enforced minimum stays to discourage occupancy. Organized groups were not allowed to secure establishments for meetings. The police on horse and foot paraded down Atlantic Avenue in riot gear. All that was needed was a riot. I know because I was there. She also mentioned in her article that, before she even got there, people were calling her and saying a lot of stuff is going on, and that she heard on her phone the terror that people were feeling and facing way before a lot of these events even happened, that kind of preemptively showed that this would happen. She also said, you know, race was an issue in the 60s. Perhaps he should have done the right thing and thought more carefully before commenting on the issue. Who knows, he may live next door to someone who would be able to give him an eyewitness account. She happened to live next door to him. And so, but the highlight of this is that, you know, 100 years earlier, and I should mention this article happens 100 years after that image that I found, we didn't hear how Black students were engaging, but we do know historically that at every point in time, even since Blacks and Africans were brought to this country, people have been fighting back. No one's been just accepting what's been happening to them. But we're actually able to see 100 years later a voice from a Black woman specifically who's speaking about what she thought and how she was engaging with this material and how she was able to see fighting back. So this brings actual hope because now we can see that we're not just silenced, we're not just quiet, but we will actually use the same medium that is used to maybe demean us, to embolden ourselves. And I can also mention, this is my mother's article.
I think you got an idea why this was such an amazing class. Let me just give you a brief summary of Alicia's work. She was trying to find information about racialized language in sciences and what was being taught. And she went through the tech, as did Kelvin, and she came across a reference to 1883, I believe it was, that an architecture student painted his version of this image on the lounge wall for the architecture students. And the commentary in the tech does not refer to this image. It really refers to the engineers were annoyed because the architecture students had much more space. And why did they have to have space? Because the engineers needed lab space and the architecture students could paint at home. Summary. So this is an image of the slave ship, which was originally titled Slavers Throwing Overboard the Dead and Dying, Typhoon Coming On. It refers to the Zong massacre in 1820. A slave ship from Africa was headed for Jamaica, overshot Jamaica. A typhoon was coming on. They needed to get rid of some of the weight on board, so they looked at the cargo. And they chose to throw the people overboard because they needed the provisions to sail back to Jamaica. This is in 1820, that was painted in 1883. They actually went to court, and the insurance company, I believe, did reimbursement for the cargo. But this picture, even in 1820, there wasn't commentary. In 1840, there's commentary Alicia found, which talks about the dramatic way of representing a new seascape, the colors used, and it doesn't address the hands coming out, the bodies in the sea and the shackles that you can see, or the sharks that are circling. There wasn't much commentary other than talking about a new genre of doing landscape or seascape painting until about 1940, where they began to acknowledge that it was depicting a horrible event. But the lack of commentary was very interesting to Alicia and to the rest of us. Why weren't they talking about the topic instead of sort of quibbling over the space in the building in Boston? She picked two other brief things to look at. One was looking through the tech. She was looking for, as I said, racialized language in science. But the first article on the first page of the first issue of the tech in 1881 was about ants and ant colonies and slave-master relationships. And she was struck that this was being used so casually. And she said, but the initials, it's ADL. I wonder if that's Arthur D. Little. And it was. He was on the editorial board that year. He was an undergraduate student here. She also began to look into what racialized language was being used in some of the coursework. Semester ran out, so she did find a few things, but those are sort of some of the things that she found. And I wanted to make sure her voice was heard here today, not as well as Alicia would have done it. She is a graduate student at Georgia Tech in mechanical engineering. Go, Alicia. So as the students were working, I began to do some work as well. We had a meeting with Philip Alexander, who has worked with Clarence Williams over the years, and Nellie Rosario, and has done a lot of work on the history of MIT. And when we met with him one day, he referred to someone at the memorial service for William Barton Rogers in 1882 talking about Rogers' Negro serving man, Levi. So let me just give you a brief chronology. Rogers was born in Philadelphia in 1804, but his father went to teach at William and Mary in 1819. So William came as a boy with his 3 brothers and his mother. His father died in 1828. He was professor of natural philosophy at William and Mary. William took over his role, so he was at William and Mary from 1828 to 1835 when William went to University of Virginia. In 1849, he marries Emma Savage. In 1853, the couple moves to Boston. MIT was chartered in 1861. Move forward. So this was the reference that we found in the memorial service. And Philip and I, over the years, had had many conversations about whether or not William Barton Rogers owned slaves. He was in the South for a very long time. He held very high positions at both William and Mary and at University of Virginia. It seemed highly unlikely, but we wanted to find some of the evidence. I know that there are many people who were not surprised, let's just say, but who felt that he did hold slaves at one point. So I was intrigued because I found this reference to Levi in the memorial service, and he's helping to show a French geologist around the countryside because he has worked so closely with Rogers over the years that he knows the geology. So I began to look for references to Charles Daubney, who was the geologist, and for Levi and for Rogers to try and get a date for when they might have worked together. I finally found a reference, which I would not have thought much about at the time if I hadn't been looking for Levi, but I found mention of Daubney's visit in January 1838 in a letter from William to his brother, and Levi is mentioned in the exact same letter. So I finally have 3 men all in the same place at the same time with a date, some of that evidence that we were looking for. But that's the only mention of Levi in Life and Letters, which was published by Rogers' wife. So I decided to see if I could find Rogers. I thought maybe he'd be mentioned I'm an archivist, so archivists do things like look at census records. So I decided to look at census records to see if he was mentioned at all in the Rogers household. I looked at the 1820 census for William and Mary, which would have been probably too early, but they do mention that there is an enslaved black woman in the Rogers household in William and Mary, most likely owned by Patrick. In 1830, I wasn't able to find Rogers yet, but in 1840, we did find that Rogers was living in Charlottesville with 2 other white men, and there were at least 2 enslaved black people in the household. But I was looking for Levi, and prior to 1850, they don't mention names other than head of household, regardless of your color. So the 1850 census, I looked and found, here's William at Charlottesville with his wife, his brother, and sister-in-law are living there. What I then found out, and I felt silly not knowing, is that there were slave schedules that were kept by the US government in 1850 and 1860. So I looked at the slave schedule, and sure enough, there was William with 6 enslaved black people in the household. 3 male, 3 female, including a little boy of 10, I'm sorry. So I'm an archivist, I like to find out where's the evidence, and I kept going back and forth with Philip saying, this is what I'm finding, this is what I'm finding, double checking all my searches, and it really was not a big surprise to a lot of people to find this information. We continue to look for Levi. We have found mention of him in letters of William Barton Rogers. When he's writing back and forth to his brothers, Levi is other brothers were geologists as well, and Levi is bringing supplies and materials back and forth to different locations in Virginia. So we're hoping someday to find out more about him. But let me just switch to the future of the project and the class. The class started out as a special subject for just last year. The first half of the year is for research. There are two separate classes in this semester. In the spring is for publishing the findings of the fall semester. We're not quite there yet with publishing, but we're getting there, doing final edits. So we have been approved for 3 more academic years. This is the first of those 3 years, and it's likely it will continue. We will need to see, obviously, we don't make that decision, Craig and I, but we expect it will continue as long as there's an interest in the class. We didn't know who would show up that first year, and we were thrilled to have Mahi, Alicia, Kelvin, and Charlotte there. In the spring class, we had 5 students, including Charlotte and Mahi. And I don't know, there was 3 other students. I don't know if any of them are here today. We also have 5 students in the class this semester. I know 2 of them were registered, but I don't know if they're here today at all. But the research is continuing. As Kelvin noted, there was research that he did in the first semester, but then when we went back to look to say the minstrel show was done as part of the tech show, do we have a program for that? And sure enough, there was a program which showed the entire cast in blackface. So it's following up on those types of leads the students are doing, asking additional questions about students, faculty, the curriculum, even more recently at anti-apartheid on the MIT campus. I'm going to stop talking at the moment because hopefully we've got a time for a few more questions and some discussion. My colleagues here, I'm sure, would be glad to answer any questions, as would I. So I open it up for any questions, comments, something you'd like to ask the students about their work, what they found, what they didn't find. This is a tiny summary. You've all done research, so you know that you do this much research to summarize it into one small piece. So,
Hi. Thank you so much. This is really incredible, and I'm so proud and to see that this is happening here at MIT. I'm Nelly Rosario. I work with Clarence Williams with the MIT Black History Project. We have a couple of lines of inquiry with a lot of the work we've been doing over the since 1995. And I have a question for Kelvin. So we basically have a hidden archive of a lot of the images that you've presented. I'd say we have about maybe almost 100 images from even dating to the present. How are we represented visually, right? How are we represented in caricature? And a lot of these images we also found in Voodoo, the humor magazine, and of course some of your sources as well. So I'm really excited. I would love that for us to sort of compare notes and see what we found. But one of my main questions has been, part of the reason why it's remained a sort of shadow archive is because I go back to, I don't know if anyone was here in 2006, but there was a huge controversy around the Visualizing Cultures exhibit depicting wood block prints from the Sino-Japanese War. These were like 100-year-old prints that was, I think they were featured on the MIT homepage. And it drew backlash from around the world. This question of what's our responsibility towards how we disseminate imagery? This is why, we're like sitting on gold, but we don't know what to do with it, right? This question of what do we do with Black caricature? How do we educate? How do we responsibly put it out into the world without giving others ammunition? And so this is just a big question. I think it's important that we all sort of think about how to disseminate and what we do with it. And so I just wanted to open that for discussion because we find all these incredible things, but we're not gonna just stick it up on a website. So that's just the main question. But thank you so much, and it's really incredible work.
I just add that it's really important when we're publishing any image, especially if it's about a culture or a group of people, that you consult those people. clearly we can see from those images that Black people were not consulted about how those images were portrayed. But you can see in the Lily White image that that portrayal of that guy in a Klansman attire, Virginia Beach, that was portraying how Black people felt about that event. And so there are images, just like there are images that don't consult and that portray stereotypes and are demeaning, there are also images where people do consult and it constructs a better image and understanding of how the community that was being attacked felt about that event. You know, who writes the history is always, you know, there's always the question, who wrote this history? But if you consult the group of people that were being oppressed at that time, or the lesser group at that time as it relates to the power dynamic, typically they have a different narrative, and that narrative isn't the one that's widely publicized, isn't the one that's known, so why not make that the image? But I also think if we're gonna publish these images and put them on websites, it's gonna be really important to contextualize it, and how we contextualize it is gonna be a big conversation, but it's gonna be really important to make sure that the image or the message we wanna get across is gotten across. And that can be done with maybe how we contextualize it. Then we do like a test and see, okay, when you look at this, what do you see or what do you think? Maybe seeing how we've contextualized it before just putting it on the website, make sure people can understand, even on the local level, making sure that image is coming across in the right way. But contextualization is gonna be key in making sure that these images are portrayed correctly.
And to briefly add on, in the second semester when we were talking about how we're going to portray this in the website, the incident you talked about actually came up in our discussions. We spent hours talking about what it means to portray even images, and we brought Kelvin into discussion too to see how he wanted to portray his findings, especially since it was so focused on images. So it's still a discussion that's going on. There's no perfect answer, but it's something that we are thinking about and have thought about a lot.
And I just add again that we can't be afraid of our history, and I think that's something that we also have to consider. I think we may not want to put these images up because, MIT may not want to put these images up because it speaks to a part of the history they may not like. And we may not want to put it up because we don't know how people are going to receive it, and we don't want that image of ourselves out there. But you know, our history, like we said yesterday, directly impacts our present, and we have to tell our history. We have to let people know. You know, you say MIT, you see things that happen at MIT, and you're like, how could that happen at MIT? But if you go back to its founding, it's been happening since its founding. But if people don't know that, then they're going to remain clueless. So we can't be afraid of sharing the history, even if it's not pleasant.
And one of the things that's been very important is to step away from that narrative of we were founded in 1861. We have to understand, there was a Civil War, Reconstruction, and that didn't mean that people's ideas or thoughts or behaviors changed necessarily. So acknowledging that these racialized languages and images were used in the early years of MIT, trying to see where they're used here, where there's inequities in labs for other staff, and how do we continue to raise up the rights and make it a more equitable and fair place for people to work, where you can have open discussion. And I think that's one of the things that has happened with this class, is to begin to talk more openly about even having a discussion, how do we share these images, is a wonderful thing to do. And I don't think we've got any restrictions from the administration about what we can and can't put up. I think we can decide. But that's just what I understand.
I'm going to ask that we have several people that are coming up to ask questions, and I appreciate that. But we are running behind schedule. So I'm going to ask that if you're going to ask a question, let's ask the question and limit the contextualization. How about that? So please ask the question, and then we'll ask maybe one person on the panel to address your question.
It's ironic you make that announcement now, because the people who are here who were here when I was here know I'm very loquacious. So I will curtail a little bit of that. My question is, given the context of your study and the racialized society we live in today, how do you look at that history and see the impact it had in parts of maybe the late 20th century here at MIT? Because I know before I got here, there were incidents with fraternities, and I remember the image you had of the Klansman in the fraternity picture. We had the PBE incident that involved BSU members. We had the ATO incident when I was here as a student with fraternity members. So I wonder if there's been some correlation between what you found then and attitudes of white students at MIT as we got into the late part of the 20th century. And then how do you take that information and disseminate it into our global society so that it can have an impact on the way people redefine the way they viewed racism and its origins and the impact it's had in our society?
It's not just the late 20th century, it's right now. It didn't stop at 2000. One of the things Alicia found, so Alicia, as Nora mentioned, also researched racialized language in the curriculum. And last year in one of her classes, they were using master-slave terminology to refer to Bluetooth devices. Yesterday, there was a sign on Killian Court that said, "It's okay to be white." This history did not, it didn't just stop at the end of our research, and it didn't stop at the end of the 20th century either. So yeah.
I just have a brief comment related to context, not so much a question, but I did, as a part of Hub Week a few weeks ago, go to Emerson College, where a film, and I believe it has been broadcast on PBS, called Black Memorabilia, was presented. And it's a documentary that really talks about this imagery in the present day. And these are actually objects that are sold at flea markets and going back to China today where they're being produced. And it's a really, really interesting way to look at the context of the imagery today. And we really need to know the history, but also to understand that these images are being sold right now to folks. And not just folks, black folks who are holding them to hold our history, but also white folks that are buying Klan memorabilia as well. So I would really recommend that you find that documentary. It was very, very interesting.
My high school was founded in Washington, D.C. in 1821, and we're going through a very similar exercise. I wanted to commend Kelvin for his comment a few minutes ago. Our headmaster said that we must own up to and admit our moral failures with the same vigor that we tout our successes. So keep up the good work.
One more. Last question? Last question.
Yeah, I just have a quick question. I was wondering if you could speak to the challenges of interpreting political satire. It brings to mind the famous New Yorker image of then candidate President Obama in a turban and his wife in militant Afro puffs, and how the person who created that image was creating it as a way of speaking out against people who thought of them that way, right? So I'm curious how you interpret and what the challenges are of actually interpreting why some of those cartoons might be there and
Yeah, this is like depending on classmates, Professor Wilder, Nora. Like I said, the first image that I found, I was like, I saw the image and I didn't return to it until a week later because that was when I found the second image. And then I had to go back and say, where have I seen this before? So for me, it was difficult, definitely unless, with those captions, with the photos that had captions, it was like easier to see. Okay, this is the intent behind this photo. But without captions, it was difficult. But definitely, depending on the people around me who are like, yeah, this is definitely what you think it is. Or Professor Wilder, who, Nora mentioned, wrote Ebony and Ivy and has studied this stuff. He was able to say, yeah, they definitely knew what was going on at this time. Just having people who understood the history, that was a big help as well. Relying on others.
Okay, I've been told I have one comment.
Yes, one comment. Just had a question about the collection of African American archives. Okay, because in the 80s I was the secretary of BAMIT, and being the pack rat that I am, I've carried around stuff, and I still have VHS tapes, okay, of meetings and different archival documents. And so my question is, where is that being centralized and, okay.
Thank you. We do have records of BAMIT at the Institute Archives and Special Collections, which are open for use according to the agreement that BAMIT had signed with the Institute Archives. And I'd be glad to talk to you afterwards and give you the contact information.
Because I think you want the feedback on what, the Black students were thinking about with different incidences. And I haven't, like I said, I haven't really opened the box in years, but, it might be something in there that would be of value.
Well, I do want to say thank you. Thank you to these panelists. Thank you to the panelists for the BSU co-chairs and the founders. And we are going to have a very brief break. It's probably like 4 minutes. So let's see, do we have, are we, oh, we're there. So we're already even starting this. So let's quickly take a quick break, and then we'll set up the next panel, and then you'll have plenty of time for questions over our lunch.
Thanks for joining us. And for more information on how to connect with the MIT Alumni Association, please visit our website.